Hi, I wanted to take a moment or a few minutes, to talk a little bit about literary analysis. I realized that through some of the discussion comments and emails I've received over the past couple of weeks that maybe we need to go back and talk a little bit about what literary analysis is, how to connect the literature to the time period and look at the influences. And just take a deeper dive together. I thought a video might be a nice way to do that. I'm always happy to meet over Zoom or over the phone if you'd like to talk through some of your ideas. A lot of times that's the best way to go about it, is talking with someone about your ideas and your questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I go about doing and conducting a literary analysis, my notes, my readings, what I look into in depth, and how I go about kind of coming up with my questions. A lot of times literary analysis is kind of like a mystery. So if you are a mystery fan, or maybe a true crime fan, sometimes you can think of it that way. I think of it as engaging with the literature, the time period, the authors, seeing how and why those influences came to be. It also is a reflection of the people, the culture, society, not only of that time, but it also tells us a little bit about our own time. What's happening politically, what's happening culturally. Sometimes we can look back historically and see some of those same influences coming into play. So for me, it's a deeper dive into something a little bit more mysterious and something exciting. So I hope you are having fun, diving into early American literature, looking at the historical context of the time, the culture, the society, and seeing how much we have grown together as a society through these works. One thing that's typical of every class I teach, whether it's in person or online, when it comes to literature, there's always a couple people who say, oh, I just don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't like it. I don't like to read, and so on and so forth. Well, and my response is usually, you just haven't found the right thing that piques your interest to read. So as we go through this literary journey together, I'm hoping that you'll find pieces that really stand out to you. With each unit, there's some great background information in the introduction of each of the pieces, the time periods. There's a lot going on. So if you take a look at your textbook, I know it looks really thick, and there's some chunks of novels in here, so don't be intimidated right off the bat. It's not as bad as it seems. Typically in the beginning of the textbook, you're going to see introductory information about the different time periods, the different influences that come into play. I always kind of peruse the index a little bit and look at the authors that maybe I recognize or not. Maybe ones that I want to look into a little bit deeper. One thing that I do like to point out, if you can see this, is a side-by-side comparison of the authors and their works and what was happening during that time period. This helps to give you a quick way to look at the context. So if I'm looking at overall changes and what was happening, I can look at this comparison to see, oh, right, I can see where somebody might have been influenced by what was happening with the abolitionist writing, the ideas between, federal and state guidelines. What was happening during that time politically? What was happening culturally? How were people expanding out west? And how did that change those ideas? So that's usually where I start. Then as I go through each piece, I start to dig a little bit deeper. And as you dig a little bit deeper into each of these authors and their writing, you're going to find a story that's being told. A story of people, a story of society, a story of how we were formed as a country, what influences were brought in. You're going to see a lot of influences that were brought in from other countries. We were built on this idea that we have all these great influences. So you can't just take it, one and done. I'm going to choose this one piece and not look at any of the contextual information. No, it's a lot broader than that. That's why even in an 8-week course, a really fast course like that, you need to dedicate that time to really understanding the influences, the time period, the history, and what other outside influences and factors could have been at play. Many of our authors during this time period didn't just stay in the United States, they traveled abroad. And as you might guess, if you've traveled abroad too, you've been a part of some of those influences. So some of our authors traveled and worked in Spain. Some of our authors traveled and worked in France. Or you see some influences coming from England. There's a lot that we see kind of intermingling into this literature. So I like to give a broad kind of overview before we dive a little bit deeper. And you can see that I have my notes up. I have my blank sheet of paper. A lot of times I actually like to use paper and pen to write my notes. So I might print out some works or print out some information and actually handwrite or annotate, that might sound familiar to some of you, annotate the pieces right on the page. Now, if you don't want to write in your textbook, that's okay too. You might want to keep the textbook for later. For those of you who might be future English majors, maybe, you might want to keep the textbook, and that's okay too. Totally up to you. What you prefer. But for this video, I thought it might be easier to use just a plain Word document and go back and forth between the pieces that I want to look at today. So the author that I chose to give as an example is one that's pretty popular in high schools and colleges and among a lot of different people, especially in the Eastern United States. Edgar Allan Poe is the author that I decided to show and demonstrate a literary analysis. I'm going to show you how I go about taking notes today and what it looks like in the greater context when I'm trying to prepare to write an essay. Know that all of these essay assignments I'm having you work with and write, I've not only written about multiple times, but with different authors. So I love digging into the different authors and I love talking to students about this. So in the discussions, that's why I'm constantly asking questions, because that's what we would do in class. We would ask each other questions, we would talk about what we're seeing, and we would reflect on what this actually means for us today. Because literature is a living document. It doesn't just live in the past. It's a part of who we are today. So with that in mind, I hope you're excited to dig a little bit deeper, and I hope this helps you to understand maybe a little bit more about how to go about writing your notes, getting some ideas for an essay. Because when I see students writing to me saying, I don't really know where to start. I have this author I like, but I'm not sure what to do. So let's dive in a little bit. I hope you're ready. If you want to get some notes out too, and you want to compare how you took notes or what you've done, or maybe even try out some of these techniques, I think that would be a great idea. I also have another video that I'll be posting for you on how to use AI to brainstorm. So if you are a fan of maybe ChatGPT, I am too, and I can show you how to use that as a brainstorming jumping off point, and why that might not be as good as something that you could come up with. So that's to come. I hope you're excited to see that too. So keep an eye out for that. All right, let's dive into this a little bit. So looking at Edgar Allan Poe, I went to the part of the textbook that gives me the author information. So I know there's a new edition of the textbook. I don't mind if you use either edition. Some people have the older edition. Some people have some information through the PDF version, the online version. Whatever version you're using, it should be fairly similar. So let's dive into the author information a little bit. So I've read about Edgar Allan Poe in the past. I know a little bit about him, but I wanted to see what this text said. So as I'm reading through, I started taking notes on it. And so I want to show you a little bit of how I take notes on the author information, the time period. And so if we flip back to that text and context chart, I can see that in 1831, when Edgar Allan Poe was writing some of his poetry, there was also some stuff historically going on. In 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, allowing Jackson to negotiate treaties with the eastern tribes for the relocation west of the Mississippi. So I might want to take a few minutes to look up what that was actually about, what happened. If you're not as familiar, or maybe you need a little bit of a reminder about American history, take a moment to look that up. Could that have been an influence? Possibly. Unfortunately, we don't have Edgar Allan Poe here with us, so we can't ask him if it was an influence. But I want to make sure that I'm aware of what was happening during that time period. Also during that time period, William Lloyd Garrison starts writing The Liberator. It's an anti-slave journal. Nat Turner leads a slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. Approximately 60 whites are killed and 200 blacks are killed in the retaliation. So I know there was some turmoil. I know there was some things going on at the time. And even though I'm familiar a little bit with Poe, I don't remember seeing stuff about that. So I might tune an eye to that as far as, do I see any influences there? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he stayed away from that. Maybe there were other influences during the time period. And I know during some of the discussions, some people brought up the idea of Romanticism, the era of Romanticism. So you might see some differences between the last unit and this unit as far as influences and how people were writing. The first unit, one student aptly said, was a little bit stuffy compared to this one. Some people said some of the readings were easier to read in this section versus the last one. And so you might start to notice some of those observations running throughout the different readings. Start to kind of compare a little bit and see what you're noticing. See if you're noticing some differences and some changes. Also important to note is that Poe was writing for a few years, so there were things going on over the course of his lifetime. Later, when he published and republished some of his works in 1845, you're going to see that others were writing. You might be familiar with a writer named Frederick Douglass. When Frederick Douglass was writing and talking on the circuit, the abolitionist circuit, about his life as a slave, maybe that had something to do with the way that the writers perceived things and wrote about different things. I know that Poe worked for a newspaper, but I might have a question about what influences were brought in during that time period or not. So digging deeper into that will help us. So on my notes, I might want to write down a question. A lot of times when I'm starting to write my question or my notes, there are a lot of questions. So I might say, what were some of the historical influences during that time? And by the way, it's hard to type when you're on camera and you have a book in front of you and all that stuff. So don't be nervous. If you end up doing a video and you mistype something, it's okay. We understand. And so I might start with a question like that. And just as a little incentive, if you like this type of video, please let me know. If you like me explaining different things along the way, please let me know. We can do videos and audio recordings within the context of the class and the discussion. But if you hang in there and watch the video a little bit longer, I have an extra credit extra incentive option for you to do a video too. So hang in there, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. I also noticed when I was reading through the short biographical information, and by short I do mean just a couple of pages, it's well worth the time to look into it. I noticed a few things that I didn't realize before. So this is what students have told me too. When we're reading through the background information, especially from this textbook, it might be different than what they've learned previously. So some of the facts and information, I always tell students double check for other areas. What did you find online versus what you found in the textbook? What did you find in other books about the author? So definitely do your research. I did find out that Poe traveled quite a bit. He had kind of a tumultuous childhood. So there might be some influences that maybe came into play as he was growing up, and not only historical influences on the author based on knowledge about his childhood. I do know that he wasn't necessarily adopted, but he and his siblings were put into essentially foster care. So they were split up, and they didn't have a foster care system at the time, but families did take them in. So I do know, according to just this little biographical information, if this is all you're going by, he was taken in by a family, and after his parents died. Now, it did say that his mother and father were both actors, and your notes don't have to be perfect, by the way. His mother and father were both actors. His father did abandon the family, so I might want to note that. Shortly before his mother passed. Then his father passed shortly after that. So I do know there were some difficult family things going on. And as many of you so aptly point out a lot, there were other influences on Poe, could be on Poe, especially when we look at the way he worked with his poetry. There's a lot of mystery and psyche involved there. So many of you bring in the idea that he was, he had maybe some substance abuse issues. And I'm going to put a question mark because I don't know if any of these things deliberately or were brought into his writing, and it's okay. This is just me digging a little bit deeper, and I guess if you're like me, you like to be a little bit nosy. But we can't make these direct connections or anything like that, but it definitely makes it interesting to look into the person's life. He did write poetry and prose. And some things that I wanted to point out, and I wanted to put in my notes too, about what he said about poetry. So in my book, it's on page 607. So I'm going to write a note because I want to make sure that if I do want to use any of this information, I properly cite it, but I want to make sure that I know which page it comes from. So if you're working with a longer text, make sure you put down the page number, because for in-text citations, you want to note not only the author's last name, but also page number. And so that's going to be important if you would like to cite information. So always write down the page number so that way you can quote it properly. So it says Poe, according to this background information, it says Poe always put his highest stock in poetry, which he called a passion. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So Poe referred to poetry, as a passion. And he also, I thought this was interesting, he also said it wasn't just a purpose. So he's kind of making a deliberate distinction between things that you do for fun versus things that you do for utility, making money. So maybe writing an article wasn't as enjoyable for him, which does play into the time period of Romanticism. And when I say Romanticism, I don't mean hug, hug, kiss, kiss like we would see with a romantic comedy, which I love those too. That's a whole other video probably about film. But it means that it was more in line with nature, more in line with independence as a writer, breaking some of those traditional forms. So just as a little side note with Romanticism, it doesn't necessarily mean what it means today. It's talking about the era of writing and those characteristics. That's something we can also dig into too. So give me a second to finish this one. I'm going to put not just purpose to remind me that there's something there I might want to look into about passion versus purpose. So that stood out to me. So when I ask you guys in the discussion, what stood out to you in the reading, this is what I'm talking about. Putting in there what you find interesting, that you could question, that you could look into later, something to keep your interests going with this. So this is how I would go through and start to take notes, start to write questions for myself, look into things deeper. And this is just a little tiny example of how I would take notes, because I just want to give you an idea of what I would do. So when I was talking about the era of Romanticism, I want to make a note for myself to look at Poe's writing to see if it fits. Does Poe fit with this idea or these characteristics or not? Oops. And again, your notes don't have to be perfect. And you can use Word to help with that. So does he fit into this or not? I did read something about transcendentalism in Emerson. I did read that he didn't necessarily fit in with the transcendentalists, so I might want to look at that too. So again, all of these notes will help me to kind of get an understanding of the writers, the historical context, and the author before I even look at those pieces. So I do a lot of legwork before I even dive into looking at those pieces. Whether or not I end up using that information is another story, but I want to go into it having these ideas in mind. So I hope this is making sense so far. If you want to pause for a second to go back and do some research on your own, to make your own notes, to kind of catch up with me so far, this might be a good place to pause it. Otherwise, let's dig into some of his pieces. Now, I know a lot of you are familiar with things like The Raven or The Telltale Heart. But what about his other works? And this is where you can get into some really interesting details. At least interesting, I hope, for you. I wanted to look at his poetry. Not only because, one, I really like poetry, it's really interesting, but two, there's so much you can get out of so few words. Let me say that again. I know it seems shorter and it might seem easier, but there's so much that you can get out of just a 15-line poem that you might not get out of a 100-page story. So if you're thinking poetry might be a little bit easier because it's shorter, yes and no. It might be one of those things where you start digging into it and you look at the context and you look at his other poems and you look at this information and you end up with more questions. Guess what? That's okay. The more questions lead you down different roads and lead you to a greater and deeper analysis. So that's not a bad thing. So because I'm working with my textbook, and I didn't want to change cameras or anything like that, I actually have some of the poems on different tabs in my web browser. So I'm going to be going through the different tabs and showing you the poems that are listed, some of the poems that are listed in the textbook. Now, this is not the end-all for Poe, and this is not the end-all for your research. Again, this is just a little smattering of how to analyze. So let's take a look at some of his poetry. So in my notes, I might want to put down which information I'm working with. And for the first poem, the first thing that stood out to me, and so I'm going to be writing on my notes, I'm going to be going back and forth a little bit. The first poem that I'm looking into a little bit more is Sonnet to Science poem. And this, in my book, is on page 608. And that's important to reference because I'm going to be referencing not only the page numbers, but also the line numbers. With poetry, MLA formatting calls for referencing in a certain way, quoting information. And for poetry, we quote based on lines and stanzas. So it's a little bit different when it comes to MLA formatting, but nothing that you can't look up and find examples of and fit your information into those examples. So I'm going to start with that. And because I'm going to be writing notes on this particular poem, you're going to see different types of bullet points come in. So when I first look at a piece, and this is what I would suggest to you too, make a note to yourself to read the piece in its entirety before even questioning anything. So that's what we're going to do together. I'm going to be focusing on, for the first part, a poem called Sonnet to Science. And we're going to come back and talk about that title a little bit. So if you are already jumping ahead with some questions, good for you. But wait a second, wait until you read it, and I guarantee you're going to have a few more questions. So let's dig into this a little bit. Sonnet to Science by Edgar Allan Poe. Science, true daughter of old time thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes. Why preyest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture, whose wings are dull realities? How should he love thee, or how deem thee wise, who wouldest not leave him in his wandering, to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies, albeit he soared with an undaunted wing? Hast thou not dragged Diana from her car and driven the Hamadryad from the wood to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from her flood, the elfin from the green grass, and from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree? So you might be thinking to yourself, what in the world did she just read? Now, I apologize for some of the stumbling over the words. You might stumble over some of the words too, and that's okay. I actually rely on some of the footnotes in the book. The footnotes are great if you're not familiar with some of the Greek terminology that he's using in here. But also, it's great. We have some great resources on how to pronounce things too. So even though I stumbled, that's okay. I like to leave that in there because sometimes you might stumble over things too, and I want you to know that it's not always perfect, and that's okay too. So you'll notice a few things about this poem. So you might want to pause here for a second and write down some of the questions you have and your initial responses just to that reading, or maybe reread it for yourself. Maybe read some of the footnotes. So you might want to pause for a second to do some reflection. After you've reflected a little bit, you might have some notes that say something like, and I'm going to go back to my notes real quick. So my initial reflection is, why a sonnet? And I'm going to tell you why I question that a little bit, the form. I thought, and this is some of the reactions that students have said in the past too. Wait a minute, I thought this era was breaking some of the form. So why that particular form? A sonnet has a particular form. If you're not familiar with how a sonnet is put together, you might be familiar with some Shakespearean sonnets. But if you're not familiar with how it's put together, there's a very distinct form, especially when it comes to lines and rhyming. So take a second to look up sonnet and you might see why I put this in here. So I also question the use of the form because I thought in Romanticism, this era and this time period, these influences, they were trying to break away from the form. So I'm going to read a question about that for my initial, some of my initial reflection. Why the Greek references? What could that mean? So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into that because even though I've got footnotes that say, what these references are, like nymph is living in brooks or fountains. Okay, I get that. I know what a nymph is, but why would he use this? And this is where we're starting to get it a little bit deeper into the analysis. Why the use of older language? So you might notice that some of the language sounds funny. Maybe you're familiar with it or not. Maybe you're a Shakespeare fan, maybe not. So why use words like thou art? Is it a nod to the form? Why use words like thou? Right? So you might be wondering that too. And a lot of times when I do a first reading, these are the reflections that I start with and I go with and I ask questions and I look at it a little bit deeper. So after I've written down a few of my my information, my questions, my reflections, I'm going to go back to the poem and dig a little bit deeper to see what I can actually find. And this is where things like ChatGPT fall to the wayside because ChatGPT can't do that awesome analysis that you're going to be doing. It can't do things like synthesizing, at least not yet. And I guarantee your questions, your references, even your confusion coming in is not going to, it's going to be a lot better than what could be generated from the computer who's only relying on certain sources. So this is a really important part in the digging. So I'm going to go back to the poem. So let's dig deeper into this particular poem. And you know what I'm going to start with? I'm going to start with the title. So let's look at the title, Sonnet. So if I pull up another tab and look up sonnet, I might find something like, and I'll show you my Word document. I put in their title, sonnet. Then I'm going to pull up another tab and I'm going to put sonnet. Let's just get a definition in there. So it's going to show me a lot of information about sonnet, but let's go with the basic dictionary definition. It's a poem of 14 lines using any of a number of formal rhyme schemes. It's very typical of English poetry and having 10 syllables per line often. So we can check for some of that stuff in our poem. But why? Why would he say sonnet to science? Why would he want it going towards science? Why would it be kind of like an ode to science? What is he saying about science? So why I would look deeper into, does it actually fit this form? Is he being serious or is he being satiric? Because I remember reading some of his background information that says part of his work is satiric and part of it is serious. So maybe he's poking fun a little bit. So back in my notes, I might write in there, is this a nod to science and form? Or is this maybe satire? Is he making fun of science? Is he making fun of something a little bit, like poking fun at it? So that's going to be an interesting question because as I dig into each line, I'm going to want to question that a little bit. So if you look at the first line, it says science with an exclamation point. So I might make a note about the exclamation point. After science, the word science. What could that mean? Typically, an exclamation point means some kind of excitement, right? And I know we use that quite a bit. We throw exclamation points around quite a bit. I'm a little bit guilty of that in my emails, just because I want to get that excitement across to people. And maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I kind of like it. It's with me now. So if you've ever emailed me, you might see some of those. But how is he using it here? Science, true daughter of old time thou art. True daughter of old time thou art. So is he saying science is part of an old time thing? And why daughter? So are we seeing a reference to something in earlier time? Is he saying something maybe about how we've changed? We're going away from science or heading toward it. What are we doing with it? Who alterest all things with thy peering eyes. So science alters things by looking deeper into them? Maybe. So I might put that in my notes too. Science, and notice how I'm kind of picking it apart, seeing if I can make sense of it for myself. What does he actually mean? What is he saying? What can I pick and dig into a little bit more? And are we doing the same thing he's saying science does? Maybe. That's a whole side note. Why prayest thou thus upon the poet's heart? So wait a minute, he has a little bit of a juxtaposition here. So is he saying science is preying on the poet's heart because it picks things apart? Oh, I just rhymed there. Or is he saying something different? So you can see how I go line by line to try and get an understanding at first. Now, I'm not analyzing yet. I'm just trying to decipher what's being said. So sometimes when students write an analysis or take a first attempt at analysis, they often do a line-by-line interpretation. It's still not analysis. What that is just a basic one-to-one interpretation. Now that's a great first start for your notes, but we want to go a little bit deeper. So after I've dug into each line, I've figured out kind of what it means a little bit. I'm going to go back and see if I can understand an overall message. Now, that overall message that I get, maybe it might be my overall message is that Poe's message with this poem is that form and science constrict poetry, the freedoms that poetry and the joy that poetry brings. Then I'm going to look at something else. I'm going to look at his other poems. For example, To Helen. Now this poem was written around about the same time period, according to the text, written or republished around the same time period. This one also has quite a few nods to Greek mythology, Greek history, and I might be questioning why. Why use the old, the Greek ideas and stories? What could that be telling me? Is there a nod to that because he did study that? Are there influences? Is he saying something also about using old imagery and old information and being stuck in the past? Maybe. I might write a note about that because that might be a common thread I'm seeing throughout some of his poetry. Notice how I start to dig into each poem and see if I can find common threads. That's analysis. You're starting to synthesize a little bit more. So taking different pieces to gain a better understanding or a deeper understanding of the poet's message. So not only did I look at those two poems that reference Greek mythology, and he has others, by the way, but I'm going to dig into some of his later poems too. So as the more I read some of the poems in the book, the more I started to wonder about his influences and the changes over time. I started to see a change in his poetry when I got to The City in the Sea. Let me read just a little bit from this. Lo, and we're seeing another exclamation point. He likes exclamation points. We might want to make a note of that. Death has reared himself a throne in a strange city lying alone, far down within the dim west, where the good and the bad and the worst and the best. So that's just one stanza from this. And you might be thinking to yourself the same thing that I thought. Wow, there's a great difference between this poem and the other poems. That was kind of exciting for me because I was seeing some progression of the writer, but maybe some different influences. And I've seen this in other writers too. So you might be familiar with Walt Whitman. We see a progression in his writing too. Well, what was happening during that time period? We had a lot of tumultuous situations going on, not only Civil War for Whitman, but also anti-slavery and slavery issues and states' rights issues. There was a lot of turmoil happening. Could this have been an influence? Maybe. I always like to think about those things and talk about them. Whether or not I bring those into my writing is another thing. When I'm doing a literary analysis, I'm focusing on the literature. What am I seeing in the literature? What poetic devices is the author using, or are the authors using? Because I could easily compare two authors too. I could compare two writings from two different authors to gain a better understanding of the time period. So you have a lot at your disposal when it comes to literary analysis and writing. I hope you're starting to see that a little bit. So as I go through and write my observations and questions, I start to get a better understanding of a message. I'm fast forwarding a little bit for you because I would take time with each of these poems to write out in-depth notes, to reflect on them, to go line by line. So you can see it takes a little bit more time, but it's well worth it if you can come up with a better understanding. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, this is all well and good, but what does this have to do with me? Why are we studying this? Why are we doing this? Well, here's one thing. Whether or not you're going to be an English professor, which I understand not everybody will, and that's okay, you are going to use analysis. Let me say that again. You are going to be analyzing. If you are going into nursing, you are going to have to not only read and synthesize journals that tell about a certain condition, but you're going to have to apply that to what you are observing with a patient. And I know bedside manner is going to come up. So when you're working with a patient, you need to not only listen to what they're saying, but you need to observe how they're acting, how they're behaving, their facial expressions. If they tell you their pain isn't that bad, but you can see it on their face, you're synthesizing, you're analyzing in real time. Maybe not as deep as we're going with our literature, but you're definitely using those skills. These are transferable skills. Now, if you've hung on with me this far, I'm glad. Because let me tell you, as I was going through my notes, and this is just a very small example of how I take notes, how I start to analyze, and how I put together a message that will help me to put together a better paper. It's a lot of legwork, I know, but it truly will pay off when it comes time to write that paper. Because if I have a message in my head that after reading 3 or 4 of these poems, I maybe gain a better understanding that Poe wanted more freedom with his writing. You're going to be asking as the reader, well, prove it to me. How do you know that? What did you do to figure that out? And I'm going to say, I looked at these different poems. I could see that he was rebelling a little bit from his writing with the sonnet to science. He was going deeper into Greek mythology for one reason or another. These are all main points that I could talk about using the poetry and the lines to back it up. I would actually give that first line maybe as a quote from The City and the Sea to back up my idea that maybe he was rebelling against more than just history and form and science, and he was going deeper into maybe something with his psyche, maybe something with the culture of the time. What is he saying in the poem Alone? We didn't even get to that one today yet, but that was another one that I looked at where he might be reflecting on culture and society and parenting and how that is maybe a rebellion in itself. So my whole paper would be about that, and I would be using different sources to back up that idea and prove it. I hope that makes sense. I would love to have more conversations with you. I'd love to see your notes and your information. Now, here's the fun part. If you would like to do a video, and it doesn't have to be this long, if you would like to do a video showing me how you are reflecting and observing and looking at this different information similar to what I did to put together your notes and to put together that paper, I will not only give extra credit, but I'll allow you to maybe add those points to the paper, maybe reworking that paper too. So you always have the option to rework a paper. If you get the feedback from me for essay 1 and you say, oh wow, now that I've seen this, I can do a way better job, prove it to me. Resubmit that paper along with a video that says, this is what I learned in the process. This is how I came up with this idea. Because one, if I can see how your thought patterns are going, how you're taking notes, what you're doing, I can also help you to improve your analysis skills, or maybe tell you, hey, you're on the right track. Let's go a little bit further. Or maybe look at how great these thoughts are right here. Capitalize on that, write about it. You have amazing ideas. You have that amazing brain that can not only analyze, but synthesize. You can do this. And I hope you can have a little bit of fun along the way. Thank you for hanging in with me today. If you have questions about my notes or how I analyze or take notes, or if you want to see another video where I would put these ideas together, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know. Let me know how I can help. I want you to succeed. I want you to do a great job learning and growing, not only as a critical reader, but also as a critical writer. These writing skills are going to come in handy later. You learning how to do this on a level with literature will easily apply to maybe a business plan if you're planning on going into business, or maybe you're going into sports medicine. Maybe you are going into a different field. Whatever it is, this is going to help you. So I look forward to seeing some of your videos, some of your notes, and I look forward to meeting with you. If you need help, please let me know. Let me know you can send me an email. You can set up a Zoom call or a Teams call with me. We can also connect on the discussion board. Please take advantage of all of these great opportunities. I know everyone is busy, but if you take a little bit of time and devote that, your analysis will be a lot more in depth, and I guarantee that you're going to have a little bit of fun too. At least I hope. I guess I shouldn't guarantee that. But thank you for hanging in there, and I hope you enjoy the reading, the writing, and I will see you in the course.